All right. We'll get this running in just a moment. Apologies for being a moment or two late. The way it's been these. How's everyone doing? Everyone doing all right with things, life, all those fun stuff that's going on? Exciting things? Everyone doing good? How you doing, Jack?
Doing well, man. Can't complain.
Good.
How about you?
Doing acceptable. Doing acceptable. Doing acceptable.
Things are adequate, huh?
Things are
Now recording.
things are what they are. You know, could complain, does no good. So
I get you. Things aren't what they aren't. So
I've been having to. It's always fun whenever I come to the AO readings because I end up getting in a discussion at some point. Someone last week was like, "How are things going?" I'm like, "Well, I'm having trouble figuring out how to actually handle a 6-year-old." Because it's, if I say disciplining, it sounds hilarious in the context of the reading we're doing and all the stuff I say every week. So that's kind of it's a fun thing to balance because 6-year-olds are 6-year-olds. It's kind of fun to see how he acts and what we have to do and trying to figure that out. So it's been very stressful because he has been growing as a human being, and who fucking needs that, right? No one wants that shit.
give it 8 more years.
That's what everyone keeps saying, and I'm like, you say that because we were all nightmares at some age, but we all forget that we were nightmares before we were really making memories. That's for fucking sure at this point.
I
So
vaguely recall.
yeah, it's we humans are it's fascinating. I'll just say that it's just a fascinating thing. All right, so let me grab this. Hit feed on screen so I can get the video going. 3 days. Here again. I'm glad everyone's doing fine. 85 Fahrenheit, 85. I'm wondering, severe weather warning of 85 feels. I mean, we're going to have 85 degrees on Wednesday. So I'm wondering. I'm not going to ask where you are, Lily, but 85
Yeah,
is
it's gonna
extreme.
be local.
Say what?
Because we're 85 too, but if 85 is bad for her, it's got to be local.
Yeah, it's got to be somewhere. It's always fun. We've been having wild swings. It was like a high of 45, and now it's going to be a high of 85 in 2 days. It's going to be a lot of swings. It's going to be a weird summer again. After a weird winter.
It's worse than us.
Yeah. So, but today we're going to be having a good time because we are actually moving forward in AO. Thank you, by the way, to those of you who joined yesterday, 2 days ago. A little recap of 3.7. Hope we got through some good stuff there because it's important as we make our way through to 3.8. We've talked about the despotic, we've talked about the earth, we've mentioned the state. But what is the state? How does the state come about? What is the formation of the state? And how does it work within a universal history? And how does it sort of fit inside of all the different things we're talking about? You'll see people, I even saw people on Twitter today conflating the despot and the state because it's easy to do. It's easy to do. It's easy to sort of, complain about the state that we have today as if it is the despot. The state, though, is something slightly different. And what is it? How does it play into it? Where does it come from? And how does it play within Marx? All of these things. And we'll be answering your questions probably, I think, the entire section today. I want to say we usually get through it in a single reading, so don't hesitate to ask questions as we go through because it's a good idea to do so. We'll be here. We'll be going through all of it. It'll be a nice, lovely time, to say the least. So I think without further ado, I think we should probably make our way right into it. Get into the UrStaat. I am streaming my text for everyone. If you want to join along, feel free to read along. Otherwise, off we go. The UrStaat. The city of the point of departure of Abraham or the new alliance. The state was not formed in progressive stages. It appears fully armed, a master stroke executed all at once. The primordial UrStaat, the eternal model of everything the state wants to be and desires. Asiatic production, with the state that expresses or constitutes its objective movement, is not a distinct formation. It is the basic formation on the horizon throughout history. There comes back to us from all quarters the discovery of imperial machines that preceded the traditional historic forms, machines characterized by state ownership of property with communal possession bricked into it and collective dependence. Every form that is more evolved is like a palimpsest. It covers a despotic inscription, a Mycenaean manuscript. Under every black and every Jew there is an Egyptian, and a Mycenaean under the Greeks, and Etruscan under the Romans. And yet their origin sinks into oblivion, a latency that lays hold of the state itself, and where the writing system sometimes disappears. It is beneath the blows of private property, then of commodity production, that the state witnesses its decline. Land enters into the sphere of private property and into that of commodities. Classes appear inasmuch as the dominant classes are no longer merged with the state apparatus, but are distinct determinations that make use of this transformed apparatus. At first situated adjacent to the communal property, then entering into the latter's composition or conditioning it, then becoming more and more a determining force. Private property brings about an internalization of the creditor-debtor relation in the relations of opposed classes. There's just so much said here. When we look back and we talk about the sort of universal history they're wanting to take us through, and that's what really 3.blank is this different type of universal history that allows a way for us to look back and understand things a little bit different, especially through the lens of the material psychoanalytic thought that they're trying to put forward. And that's why the book is arranged as it is. When we make our way through, it's easy for us to think of the state as the pieces or the form that it takes today and talk about the different ways that it has grown. Oh, the state was different prior to the bureaucratic democratic state. It was a bureaucratic monarchic state. And prior to that, it was a bureaucratic despotic state. And there are differences in these things. Be easy for us to do that. But there is something odd about that because it ultimately still means the state is there. The city of is, they use as a point of departure. It's the oldest city that there is. And it's in Iraq. There's a great photo. I used the first reading we had of this of a bunch of American soldiers standing in front of it, which is just wild to consider the historical reality of. But this moment, this place, the city of this is the departure point, they say. But it is where the state comes effectively fully formed all at once. It has everything it will ever need in those moments. It has everything it will ever want in those moments. There are details that will change and shift over time, obviously contingently. But instead of thinking of it as, oh, look, the state changes over time, or the state is this sort of, I don't know, safe bureaucratic thing. It's purely bureaucratic. There's nothing that sort of impinges on desire at all. It's important to take a step back and rethink our relationship with the state in that way. That the formed, the example they use, the palimpsest, it's basically the way that you end up having printed words that underneath printed words. It's almost like a painting that's painted over, that you find like versions of the painting underneath it. And so you end up reusing the same documents over and over. Think of it like, I almost prefer it. I think last time around we talked about it like VHS tapes that you used to record over and over and over because, you know, you couldn't afford a ton of them. So how else are you going to watch Star Trek? How else are you going to watch Star Trek? So you record it and you record the next one over that one, next one over that one, next one over that one. There's using the same over and over and over. it covers the despotic inscription, Mycenaean manuscript. It doesn't really matter that there was this setup for despotic. There's these other layers that get added on top of it. It's this palimpsest, as they're calling it. And the origin of this disappears, this latency, as we talked about in 3.7, and as they've been very much talking about psychoanalytically throughout, this latency that lays hold of the state itself, where the writing system sometimes disappears beneath the blows of private property, the separation and conditioning of land. Land enters this sphere. The people enter the sphere. Classes appear. These are the parts that start to show up. And these elements are part of the way that the state is formed. And this is where they're going to be going through the rest of this very short section, probably far too short for my taste. I would have loved if they'd expanded out on the UrStaat concept a lot more. But they do a decent job of it. And so that's where we're starting, talking about the state as this form through time. Hey, Raj.
Hello, can I say something?
No, you're not allowed to talk.
Okay. But yeah, something we miss it a lot. It's at the beginning of the paragraph, the point of departure of Abraham or the New Alliance. And the New Alliance is really interesting and important there because it's the covenant between nations in the state. So there's a distribution there's an agreement and, between God and the different people, but also between the tribes. And there's responsibilities being distributed there. So the state appears in this coming together in an alliance, but also in the distribution of responsibilities. So it's articulate. It's the kind of like diagrammatic machine that is behind the agreement. So, little term that is right to the beginning and is really important. So if you want to look into that, into the story of Abraham and how he got all the tribes together, that would help to understand the UrStaat.
Actually, really actually important and worthwhile for us taking a moment, because they will come back to this a few times, and to the idea of this. When we talk about, again, the despotic formation, we spent a lot of time on in 3.7. We went back over it again. The despotic formation, Asiatic production, the way that many nations, or you may say nations, you could say indigenous tribes, many groups, many cities, many towns, whatever, brought under heel of one despot. Abraham is that. Like this is as Roger's saying, the point of Abraham's story, even biblically, is that he united the tribes, and this uniting of the tribes comes at once. This is kind of their point, that the state isn't formed in progressive stages that some have proposed, where we have on one side, oh, look, over here, these guys were kind of working on this bureaucratic thing. Oh, these guys over here were talking about private, like, no, it's at once, because the necessity of that bureaucratic element, that the state as it comes, is needed when you have all of these tribes in the new alliance, as they say, with the despotic, and all of these people working together. It's necessary to then delineate, well, this land is this tribe, this land belongs to this group, this land belongs here, here is the land these guys can use. And you start parceling out. And by the way, here are the classes. These are the people who are within the state or without the state that are within this grouping. And here's how they're able to do stuff. Here's the people who have power, don't have the favor of the despot, don't. All of these things are necessary to even have any element of what we would consider the sort of state bureaucratic apparatus. Is that a fair way to answer that, Raj?
Totally.
Cool.
But it's really this coming together, and they're going to go into, because that's what you said. There's the universal history, but there's the contingent forms, or the how reality expresses itself. So you'll have different forms of states, but the core element is the alliance that happens between people and how it's formalized.
Yep.
So that's the core of it. That's the universal aspect. And then, every empire or every modern nation will have a different type of state, but they're all always contingent to how the arrangement is being brought upon.
Everyone getting this one? Not a wild paragraph where it's mostly talking about the stuff we're going to be expanding on. And there's only really, I think, like 7 paragraphs total in this, maybe 6 that we have left. So this one goes fast. So do be asking questions as we go. If you have a question about why they're saying this or how this thing works, or if you're misunderstanding X, Y, and Z, don't hesitate to type up. I'm keeping an eye on all that. We'll make our way through. Don't worry.
Can we say one thing before we go, if you don't mind? Because they talk about classes, and they say classes appear. So, in certain theories, the classes are already there, and the state, as some kind of neutral machine, becomes, possessed or used by classes. So this reverses the process. The state creates classes. So the state in itself, the more primordial kind of arrangement will distribute forms of ways of being, or like economic classes or economic relations. So it's like reading it on reverse compared to a lot of the economic or political theories that we see elsewhere.
Yeah, it's the lines that they have there. I'm not crazy about the translation, but it's fine. Is classes appear in as much as the dominant classes are no longer merged with the state apparatus, but are distinct determinations that make use of this transformed apparatus. The way that we might talk about the chief or the perverts going from town to town on behalf of the despot, they are, again, this is sort of the determination, just the same way that a king and a despot, the king and the despot aren't really the same thing. One is the body of the king, one is the whole body of the despot. We might say the same thing here. So with classes, they appear in as much as they're no longer merged with the apparatus, but are distinct determinations that make use of this transformed apparatus. They're not necessarily the priest, who may be directly part of the state apparatus, but instead the wealthy person outside of that, or the elite outside of the state that's utilizing that apparatus sort of on their own. So it's a slight shift in exactly how to think about it. Again, the state isn't creating these classes. The classes appear as part of this because of how they interact with the state. Again, super important. This is not someone inventing the state out of, in 9 different ways, and slowly the state comes to form, which I think is how colloquially I understand a lot of people to sort of think of, oh, agrarian society showed up, and then of course we had to have the state because we had to do taxes, and then this piece showed up in this piece, and it's like, no. The moment you have a person like Abraham who's uniting tribes and lands, how else can that be united other than the state as we know it?
And then you can go further, because this is going to be important into the understanding of AO in general, but the Deleuze and Guattari's theory, it's the distribution of roles and distribution of positions. So, or like you could say identities anyway. But we are the result of this distribution. There's no essence to it. We're just like in this process, and we're being determined by the transformation within the apparatus. And our position, our roles, what we do, how we act, how we interact with another, is the result of those distribution, and not the other way around. There's not like essentials kind of form of being or identities that interact and like create relations. It's the relation that precedes, or the arrangement of relation that precedes the modalities of being, if I can say it like that. So little paragraph, really important, tells us a lot about what is to come at the political level.
Yeah, and it's also, as I like to remind everyone, it is also only half a paragraph. The English version does this a lot. This is one of those places where it's half a thought, because the second paragraph here is actually the same paragraph in the original French. This gets broken up because why not? So to read the next paragraph, and don't hesitate to be typing questions while we're doing this. But how does one explain both this latency into which the despotic state enters, and this power with which it reforms itself on modified foundations in order to spring back more mendacious, colder, more hypocritical than ever? This oblivion and this return. On the one hand, the ancient city-state, the Germanic commune, the feudalism presupposed the great empires and cannot be understood except in terms of the UrStaat that serves as their horizon. On the other hand, the problem confronting these forms is to reconstitute the UrStaat insofar as possible, given the requirements of their new distinct determinations. For what do private property, wealth, commodities, and classes signify? The breakdown of codes, the appearance, the surging forth of now decoded flows that pour over the Socius, crossing it from one end to the other. The state can no longer be content to overcode territorial elements that are already coded. It must invent specific codes for flux that are increasingly deterritorialized, which means putting despotism in the service of the new class relations, integrating the relations of wealth and poverty, of commodity and labor, reconciling market money and money from revenues, everywhere stamping the mark of the UrStaat on the new state of things, and everywhere the presence of the latent model that can no longer be equaled, but that one cannot help but imitate. The Egyptians' melancholy warning to the Greeks echoes through history. Greeks will never be anything but children. Oh, God. I'm trying to figure out how to talk about latency as a thing here. Again, when we talk about latency, they are utilizing sort of the traditional psychoanalytic term of it, that there is this thing coming, the latent nature of something, that it's underneath, that it's waiting, that it's the potential of it is there. So how do we explain both the latency into which the despotic state enters? Because once the state is there, there's other pieces waiting. There's a lot of other things going on. And this power, which reforms itself on modified foundations in order to spring back more mendacious, colder, more hypocritical than ever, the oblivion in return. They're talking about how the nature of the state seems to change quite a bit, even though the state is ultimately still there. And how does it handle that latency? And how do we have both the latency of knowing these things will be changing, but also the ability to change them or have them change? I think would be the way to do it or talk about it, because it's a really fascinating thing when we try to do this. They use the example here. On the one hand, the ancient city, this Germanic commune, this feudalism, these things suppose the great empires to come, the Roman Empire, Alexander the Great, I don't know, the fucking Third Reich. I mean, like, there's this kind of presumption that there is these great empires. These basic things presuppose that, and they can really only be understood in terms of the UrStaat itself, because that is their horizon. It sees them. It knows that it's coming. It sees these things. On the other hand, the problem of these forms, the feudalistic Germanic commune, is to reconstitute the UrStaat as much as possible. They can't form the next thing, the next state, the next, they can't move into a new epoch or change or anything unless they reconstitute the UrStaat as much as possible, considering the given requirements of this new separate determination, the new way that things are showing up, the new way that things have moved around. How do we have to bring the state into this? I think a decent example of that would be the Bolshevik Revolution and then the ensuing state that came from this. Communism doesn't have a state, so what the fuck? Well, it's because the UrStaat as the horizon of essentially all of these things. You need to, as you move to new determinations, new people in charge, new things in charge, new ways of being, whatever it may be, you must reconstitute the UrStaat as much as possible to do it, because ultimately the way that the state works and what the state does is cover up the problems of how those things are disintegrating. As revolution may happen, or as changes happening, as we have, as they say here, property, wealth, merchandise, and classes, as these things now exist, and as they become more, those are decoded flux. This is the shift of things. They're decoded desire, their desire running free. And that's not a thing any of us want. It's not what we want. Oh, no, we can't have such a thing. And so as such, we need to overcode them. We need to figure out a way for the state to bring them back in, to put them in there, so that way they're in relation to the parts of the state. The examples they give, putting despotism in the service of new class relations, integrating the relations of wealth and poverty, commodity, labor, reconciling market money and money from revenues. This is the way that this is shifting. This is the changes that are coming, and it has to overwrite them because we cannot have desire freely running. Yes, JK.
Yeah, I like that line, putting the despot in the service of the new class relations. Is the UrStaat, itself, the embodiment of the despot, and that, but it's going through changes in terms of class relations, class structures. It's breaking down, but but the decoding and coding process, is a way of putting the UrStaat, the despot, uh, and integrates them into these different class structures.
Um, so it interacts with, I would not say it's the same as the despot. There's a reason that they do have like an entire section about the despotic machine, and they have another section about the UrStaat. And they're going out of their way to very much utilize them in particular places. The state doesn't take credit for production. The state never becomes a quasi-cause for production, unless, again, it takes the place of the despot. But this is the space of the despot. The despot becomes the quasi-cause. All is done through and for the king or God or the queen, whatever it is. The state isn't really that thing. The state is this larger bureaucratic apparatus that is also affecting and playing with and being put in service of these things, while also causing them to serve. It's probably incorrect. Roger's here, so he'll at least be able to yell at me. The closer way to think about it is, in my mind, as we went through Oedipus in chapter 2 and chapter 1, and we talk about how Oedipus sort of creates repression, and it feels like we need to have this repression to control desire. And it's a structure and a sort of superstructure that ends up sort of promulgating itself, that reproduces itself as it goes. Oedipus doesn't really control anything. It's just kind of this weird superstructure arrangement of our unconscious that seems to be in service of and alongside our ego and this certain subjectivity of repression. That's, for me, much closer to what the UrStaat is socially. We see the world and we go, look, we can't let people just have like all of these abstract things and desire running across the social. We need to keep things in check. And we've got the new king. We, like all of us as a large scale or social group, want this sort of superstructure that's knowable and safe. And the UrStaat plays that role. The king doesn't put the UrStaat in place. The people don't really put the UrStaat in place. Instead, it's the formation of things that seem to allow us to control our desire and seem to repress us in that way that we really, really just like. And it's doing it in some pretty particular ways. But the biggest is, as they outline in this paragraph, that as we move forward in time, we have a significant breakdown of codes as we move from the earth, which is basically intense coding, to the despotic, where now suddenly we have to sort of find a way to connect the sort of global meta codes of the kingdom, or the large scale sort of giant super state, to each of these tribes. And the tribes can keep their stupid little codes, but now the codes mean something different. We actually have to overwrite them in order to make sure that they're part of the larger thing. But that overwriting creates sort of this weird abstraction space. And at some point, when we move into capital, we're going to see that abstraction space have this same problem that they're outlining here, where now we have commodities and classes and private property and wealth. And these are not things that are codes. These can't exist in code. They actually really can barely survive in overcoding. There's a whole thing about that in 3.7 we went through. So instead, the state is there to make sure and to regulate and hold forth and deal with these things. It cannot just overcode these elements that it's already coded. It needs to now invent these codes for the flux that are increasingly deterritorialized. It needs to put despotism in the service of class relations. This is a move that changes with capital, where class relations were really in service of the despot. Again, everything for that. But now we have a new setup. So the despot and sort of replays that. The changes how they react. And there's a distinct move where we went from the king is, or the pharaoh controls all, to slowly the cabinet controlling all, to slowly the Congress controlling all. And these things ultimately put the space of the despot in service of, until it's subsumed ultimately. And now we move into capital, which is a different beast. But the state did this. The organization of the state, in its lies, its mendaciousness, its lies, its coldness, its hypocrisy, this thing that it's doing, it's able to make the moves necessary to maintain and control desire at that social level. So to me, it's like almost an Oedipal social construct, the way that Oedipus works within the unconscious. Probably not the best way to phrase it, but that's how I've been understanding it.
So you say that the state and the and UrStaat is a form of state is never not subordinate to the despot, right? The despot is the full body that continues to operate and overcode and so forth. And so a country like England still has a king and a queen and so forth, and they are symbolic. But are you saying that they also is a kind of they represent this kind of despotic body?
They play differently. Yeah, I know it's a weird one, and it is. It's kind of hard to sort of talk through. Again, they didn't do a lot of work on the state in any of their writings, even secondary writings, except for like this one paragraph and a lot of stuff in AO, a little bit in ATP, and a little bit of Guattari's writings, but mostly they didn't deal with social formations, not in this style. So there's a lot of inference that has to be done to sort of talk about what this means in a larger way. In the text, the bigger thing is that we understand that these elements, this structure, is able to sort of make its way because of how it works and what it does. It's able to shift and adjust to ensure that it's constantly able to, in some capacity, maintain the repression of ultimately desire and the codification of desire in one way or another. And so when we have, as he's saying towards the here, reconciling market money and money from revenues, this is the mark of the UrStaat on the new state of things. And everywhere the presence of the latent model cannot be equaled, but that one cannot help but imitate. The joke, you Greeks will never be anything but children, is kind of this play that there's no kind of way around this. You're always going to be in this position. Is that making any sense or no sense? I'm hoping some sense.
Yeah. So the everything is in harmony in a capitalist society and so forth, and because it's part of this evolution of infinite debt, right?
It's there's a genie. We're not quite at capital yet. There's a lot that you said there that I'm kind of going to be like, we'll get there. Don't worry. But the big thing to understand is how the state interplays with it. It's one of the challenges for Marx is, and I think a lot of people talking about how the state forms through time, and it's a big issue, is how do we talk about the state as a thing given the multitude of forms that it's taken and how it's utilized. If we were to move into, say, a commune-based communist sort of utopia that has, large-scale state apparatus, is that not just more of the state? What does the state mean in these conditions so we can understand it best and we're able to really, again, understand the social determinations that are building us and creating our repression and how we deal with it? Because if we just go, oh, no, the state, there's just no state. and that's good old anarchism. There's no state, but we're going to have large scales of councils that we vote into place, and those councils will have other councils that they vote into place. And then, of course, we're going to end up needing, someone at the top. At what point are we not just recreating the state yet again that will spring back, as he says, more mendacious, colder, and hypocritical than ever? The state doesn't give a shit about these things. It's able to do this because it's basically the formation that we've had since we started these large scale projects. With is a real state.
So for Deleuze and Guattari, is the ideal society one where there's no despotic, latency, even latent despotism?
Yeah,
Or you have
the state brings the latency. We're going to be getting to that in the next paragraph, which is a long one, so I'm kind of holding off unintentionally. But that's the question. And Petita, all this is despotic state versus other types of state. All of this is talking about how the state is as it needs to be, that the despotic state and other types of states are still the state. They are this large new alliance. They are the alliant playing in this way. That it doesn't matter how we go, that this is what the state does. We'll get that in the next, I think the next paragraph goes over that nicely. Any questions, comments, anything here? I'll give it a moment. Happy to have the awkwardness for a moment. Anything to add, Raj? Am I doing all right so far?
Yes.
Excellent. Just making sure. Just making sure. Because it's tough. There's a great book. It's on the server somewhere. State and Politics. Who's the author of that? It is Guillaume Sibertin Blanc. And it is probably, it's a really fantastic sort of breaking out of the state form through a Marxist lens, through AO and ATP, and really talking about the state apparatus and how it sort of works. If we have time, we may go through a handful of those things, but it's really fantastic to just read a little bit of what he wrote, because I really do enjoy it.
And for the longest time, if you were looking into the politics, and Deleuze and Guattari, there was nothing available. Basically, that's the first book that actually synthesized and looked deeply into what could be the politics of Deleuze and Guattari. And if you're trying to make,
it's really great to read. The singularity of Deleuze and Guattari's theory of the state comes first from the fact that it is based on a questioning of the very possibility of making the state an object of theory, in the sense of a conceptual practice that masters, at least rightfully, its own operations of intelligibility. This is apparent both in Anti-Oedipus and in the 13th Plateau, in the fact that this theory takes a profoundly aporetic form. The aporia appears in different ways that are interconnected while interacting each time with specific interlocutors. First, it touches on the anthropological historical problem of the origin of the state, and proceeds to a deconstruction of this problem itself by means of a dialogue with ethnological and archaeological disciplines that each resituates in its own way the problems of the conditions of emergence of a separate apparatus of power within social formations that did not contain it. As we've been going through and talking about the way power and debt is moving around in Earth, and then despotic, we aren't actually talking on the state, but the state came along with this. And as they say, that resituates in its own way the problem of the conditions of the emergence of and this is the emergence of the state, emergence of a separate apparatus of power within social formations that did not contain it. The state wasn't really contained in the social formation of the despot. Not really how it worked. It came about because of the way that the despot necessarily interacts with many tribes and how the laws have to be done. But it's not really a thing that's natural within the despotic himself. A despot could run as a chief and run nobody. They could have power consolidated within a small group. Would we call that necessarily the state? Well, actually depends. We'll get to that. This is the problematic nature. This is what they're going over, what he's saying Deleuze and Guattari are going over. Yet this dialogue leads the simply empirical resolution of the problem of origin to an impasse. On one side, the genesis of the state form there is revealed to be impossible, and its historical beginnings cannot be ascribed. The problem of the origin of the state runs up against the unresolvable mystery, one which, as Pierre Clastres noticed, has the pitfall of the always tautological allure of genetic or evolutionary explanations of crossing a state threshold. The idea that you weren't a state, and because, oh, I think I see one, oh, there's the state. The aporia of the origin of the state then moves into a philosophical and speculative. It focuses on the materiality of the state. This is what we're reading right now. And more precisely, on the impossibility of identifying the state form with its material apparatuses. On the one hand, Deleuze and Guattari maintain the need to account for the state from the socioeconomic conditions that are the only ones to explain the disparity between its concrete historical formations and the plurality of ways in which it transformed through the becoming of societies. On the other hand, the aporia of evolutionist explanations of the state require problematizing the efficacy of the movement through which the state form seems to presuppose itself and produce on its own the material conditions of its own institutional apparatuses. While the aporia of the origin, on the level of anthropological and historical positivity, stumbles against an apparent mystery that makes the state inexplicable in its genesis or emergence, it then falters on the level of philosophical decisions in the undecidable relationship between an idealist and materialist conception. In other words, the two antinomical ways of thinking the effectiveness of this appearance itself to antinomical ways of understanding the Darstellung, or the apparent objective movement of the state. This is the two sides of basically, I mean, it still really rages today, the discussion of what makes the state come about. How does it work? The Marxist on one side, idealists on the other. How do we know when the state appears? Oh, I know it when I see it, kind of conversations. And this is what they're trying to, I don't want to say supersede, but step aside from, because this kind of dichotomy, this kind of problematization, they don't see in the same way. They're stepping aside and realizing how the state forms and then becomes its own machine within other machines that can attach and go with machines as it needs to necessarily. Really good book. I'm reposting it in here if you want to check it in. For those of you who are looking for it, State and Politics. Wonderful book. And I'm on my second read through of it because I'm not sure I fully grasp everything he's writing about in there. Dude really goes deep. It is not a small book. It is not an easy read. But it's very, very good. And highly, highly recommended. Highly recommended. See. I guess we go to the big paragraph. Kind of two giant paragraphs, and then, yeah, we're almost nearing the end of the section. It's the fun part of this one. And then we move into capital. So it's kind of important to grasp a lot of the shit around the state because of that. Because again, the move from one form to the other, the becoming of societies, is not that there's a different state or that there's been many states. There's been one state that's able to adjust as necessary based on the power dynamics and the production of subjectivity within it to maintain the particular controls that a state is there for, is there, a fucking terrible combination of words, that a state enforces at the behest of its citizenry, but also the formation overall that is still recognizable as such. It's really a fascinating thing. We'll get through this paragraph. I hope it helps a little bit. There's a lot in here as well, a lot of references. Clastrus Society Against the State is a wonderful read. It's referenced here really quick. And it's one of the things, another very much worth reading. The idea that ancient societies literally were against the idea of the state. Not that they had a conception of it, but that they really spent their time ensuring that power was never centralized, that it was one of the ways that they sort of worked and how they were built. Really fantastic book on that. But the state, back to the state. To continue. This special situation of the state as a category, oblivion and return, has to be explained. To begin with, it should be said that the primordial despotic state is not a historical break like any other. Of all the institutions, it is perhaps the only one to appear fully armed in the brain of those who institute it. The artists with a look of bronze. That is why Marxism didn't quite know what to make of it. It has no place in the famous 5 stages: primitive communism, ancient city-states, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism. It is not one formation among others, nor is it the transition from one form to another. It appears to be set back at a remove from what it transects and what it resects, as though it were giving evidence of another dimension, a cerebral ideality that is added to, superimposed on the material evolution of societies, a regulating idea or principle of reflection, terror, that organizes the parts and the flux into a whole. What is transected, superseded, or overcoded by the despotic state is what comes before, the territorial machine, which it reduces to the state of bricks, of working parts, henceforth subjugated to the cerebral idea. In this sense, the despotic state is indeed the origin, but the origin as an abstraction that must include its differences with respect to the concrete beginning. We know that myth always expresses a passage and a divergence. The primitive territorial myth of the beginning expressed the divergence of a characteristically intense energy, what Marcel Griaule called the metaphysical part of mythology, the vibratory spiral, in relation to the social system in extension that it conditioned, passing back and forth between alliance and filiation. But the imperial myth of the origin expresses something else. The divergence of this beginning from the origin itself, the divergence of the extension from the idea, of the genesis from the order and the power, the new alliance, and also what repasses from filiation to alliance, what is taken up again by filiation. Jean-Pierre Vernon shows in this way that the imperial myths are not able to conceive a law of organization that is immanent in the universe. They need to posit and internalize the difference between the origin and the beginnings, between the sovereign power and the genesis of the world. Quote, "The myth constitutes itself within this distance. It makes it into the very object of its narrative, retracing the avatars of sovereignty down through the succession of generations to the moment when a supremacy, this time definitive, puts an end to the dramatic elaboration of the dynastie." End quote. So that, in the end, one no longer really knows what comes first, and whether the territorial machine does not in fact presuppose a despotic machine from which it extracts the bricks, or that it segments in its turn. Big paragraph, I warned you. I did warn you. To read the footnote really quick, they mentioned the 5 stages. The 5 stages, this is Marx. Read Marx. Marx is good. Regarding whether it is possible to bring Asiatic production into agreement with the 5 stages, and regarding the reason behind Engels' renunciation of this category in Origins of the Family, and the Russian and Chinese Marxist resistance to this category, see Godelier, sur le mode production asiatique, reference note 47. One may recall the insults addressed to Wittfogel for having raised the simple question. Wasn't the category of the Oriental despotic state challenged for reasons having to do with its special paradigmatic status as a horizon for modern socialist states? We'll get to that. That footnote's important for that section. This is a big paragraph. Does someone else want to take a crack first? Anyone, please? Anyone? Jack, I know you're here. Fuck, maybe I don't know that. Let me doubt myself.
What was going on? Sorry, I was
Yeah, see, Ben,
only half
no
paying
one.
attention.
That's okay. So's everyone else. Trying to figure out how the fuck to even start on this paragraph.
Oh, but both how?
What?
Or no, this special situation.
Please expand.
No, which paragraph are you?
Oh, we're on the special situation of the state as category. How as I was reading from State and Politics right before, this section is very. This section is about the sort of traditional issue that we have of the idea of the state coming in pieces, and maybe it's there, and then at some point because we have the state now, we compare things, and it's like, oh, that's 20% of a state, that's 30% of a state. But their argument, and I think it's a big one and a good one, is that actually the state comes at once because it has all the parts it needs. It has the ability to overcode. It has the ability to enact power structures. It has the ability to sort of arrange and control. It does a bunch of these things. Why? So these pieces that exist, they've existed since was created, since Abraham united the tribes, since we had that first new alliance. The state, as we know it, had all the pieces it would ever need. It's taken on new forms. Sure, it's taken on other elements, but ultimately, the despotic state that sort of takes on the territorial element, the territorial machine, it doesn't like erase it. What it does is it turns the territorial machine, the local tribes, it turns all of their code and all of the work that they do into bricks that it's able to then move around as necessary. The reason they use bricks and they talk about it very physically is because of the Great Wall of China as the sort of Kafka's sort of story of this. It's also, again, Asiatic production plays into this. There are lots of different words for it. I'm using Asiatic because the other word that they usually use for it is a little bit shittier. But the setup for this is that they take those tribes, the state is able to brickify local issues, local customs, local work, local anything, local labor, whatever it needs to be, and the brick can be adjusted and moved and put over here, and put over here, put over here, and we're able to build effectively our own Great Wall of China, or our own Hadrian's Wall, or our own blank thing, whatever the fuck it is, our own London, our own Denver, our own Manhattan or Wall Street, because the bricks are able to be moved as they need to be. And this continues all the way through. This continues all the way up. It's the bricks being used. A great example, Otter. It's the Berlin Wall, but also building Parliament. The way that things are made, the way that things are produced, the way that these things come together, is taking the territorial machine and pulling it into these bricks and then moving those elements around. And the state does this, kind of always has. This is what the state's job has been. Hey, look, these guys have a bunch of lilies. That's their specialty. Well, that's now ours, so we're going to move those around the kingdom. Hey, look, we found this country. They're really good at spices. Let's form a fucking company that just, like, let's move those spices around. Like, the local realities turned into these. But this isn't sort of the setup as Marx talked about it, where he talked about kind of the 5 stages of the state, where it's primitive communism. This is Marx and Engels. Primitive communism, ancient city-states, feudalist states, capitalist states, and ultimately the the socialist utopian state, or the future communism, not opposing primitive. This is the thing. Those 5 stages are really just the state, and we need to see how these larger, this is why they utilize the Socius primarily, moving from the territorial to the despot to capital, because the move to the despot, the creation of the state's part of it, but it isn't that we now have other versions of the state. It's that the state has other versions of ways it interacts. It is not one formation amongst others, nor is it a transition from one form to another. This remove of where we take back what it intersects from what it resects, as though it were giving evidence of this other dimension. The way that the state operates is a cerebral, abstract category. It is this really odd thing that we're able to see, that is able to work, that's able to do what it does, and it does it at large, and it does it, I mean, broken or not, it does what it does well. And so the despotic state transects, supersedes, overcodes what comes before it, which is the territorial machine. But that's all that it continues to do. The state's just continuing to do that as it moves forward, as it is finding new setups, as it's finding new things to do. It's just doing those same things. It's taking those steps and moving forward. It's part of the despotic, but it is continuing on, for lack of a better word. That's how I would probably put it.
Do you know what he means by that word, dynastia at the bottom?
Oh,
It
that's a
refers
great
to
one.
62, but I try to find it, but couldn't.
Old reference. I have notes on this, that it's some old fucking super old, like Plato Aristotle thing. Let me see what I can find. Dynasty. The dynastia would be sort of the Greek version of dynasty, as Alexander would have used it specifically. Understood by the Greeks to mean non-responsible collective tyranny, or a narrow oligarchy. Which actually gives interesting meaning to that. The myth constitutes itself within the distance. It makes into the very object of its narrative, retracing the avatars of sovereignty down through the succession of generations to the moment when a supremacy, this time definitive, puts an end to the dramatic elaboration of the dynastia, or the narrow oligarchy. The interesting word, actually. It's commonly used against the Macedonian state, it looks like, specifically.
Yeah, thank you.
It's fascinating. I'm going to see what I can find. Concept of, this will be good. Let me see if I can find this on the library. Wow, nothing. Done. All right, I'm going to see what I can find. I'll post something up for you. See what I can do.
Thanks, Brooks.
Fascinating. All right. I guess I'll go through comments and everything before we move forward. Otterwaffle, the distance, le heart, ends, limits, etc., and how they pass from one shape size to another. It's beautifully written. I agree. It is very much talking about space throughout all of it. It's why he's using the terms and have been using the terms. The territorialization, the deterritorialization, the horizon, stratification. Like, he's going to use all of these terms because
it's topographic as well.
it is deeply topographic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there's the difference between topographic analysis and analysis that looks into the depth of thing, because there's no depth. It's just surfaces and connections.
Bricks must be pretty obvious in Europe. Well, the Wall of Berlin is up. I think it's interesting when you start thinking of the way they're talking about sort of the overall way that bricks, again, to talk about the physicality or the spatiality of things, the nature of the commodity or the modern economy, the great striated, sporadic nightmare that we have, the way that everything is bricked up and moved. If you start looking around your space or spaces you walk through, don't just think of bricks as literally just bricks, like, oh, it's a brick in a wall, brick in a building, although that also applies here. But think about that everything is these bricks, the labor and work that's done. There's, I grew up in Colorado, and there's a famous town called Marble, Colorado, where the best marble in America came from. And it's actually what they use to make all of the statues and monuments in Washington, D.C., is all the marble from Marble, Colorado. That literally was like this town, a bunch of people who lived there, sort of carving out. And now it's devoid, it's poor, it's horrifying. This way that things are bricked up, and the vitality of a town, vitality of an area, vitality of a village, vitality of a local people, bricked up, moved, done, out we go. And how this happens, it's kind of everything. And it can be micro bricks. It doesn't have to be like full real bricks. It can be, you know, the tiny parts of, I don't know, I buy some shit on Amazon that has a battery in it. You're talking about billions of bricks that are inside of it. So when we talk about these things, it's really fascinating to think of it as well, because we're talking about the literal utilizing of bricks for building a structure, but also how the structure builds bricks. Fun stuff. Rimka, am I correct in understanding they say that Marxism didn't include the despotic state in their 5 stages because they saw the Oriental despotic state as an argument for their socialism model of state? How to read that footnote? That is actually a really good question. How to read that footnote? That's actually a really fucking good question, Rim. So when we talk about how China and the USSR operated, it was that. And it's one of the things, it's the Wittfogel line is about that at the very end there. It's people really were quite upset with him when he asked, isn't the category of the Oriental despotic state challenged for reasons having to do with its special paradigmatic status as a horizon for modern socialist states? Boy, it sure looks like it was what Russia and China were going for with the USSR and with the Republic of China. That's kind of their commentary there on the second half. The first half, and it's why they're saying that Engels got rid of it, is boy, Engels is fucking tough on this one. Yeah, that's actually going to be a larger question. That's a good question. That's a thing to fucking dig into. We are reading the one chapter of this book that literally has almost no exegesis, period. I don't think there's any exegetical writing on this except for the one book I've published and posted up there, the one. I don't think there's anything like that. Which is very frustrating. But hey, what are you going to do? Let me see if I can find, well, I'll let someone else talk or answer a question while I find a couple of those footnotes and the text within. So I'll be here, but I'll be taking a second. I just don't know enough about Engels is the problem. I tend to, I don't know. I have a fucking stick up my ass about Engels. I don't really care for a lot of some of his stuff. But that's just me. What can I say? Well, I did find the Godelier piece, so let's see what we can do here. Let's get it downloaded. Oh, no. No. Nope. Fuck you. Notion of the Asiatic mode of production in Marx and Engels. Let's see what our friend Godelier has to say. The notion was developed from a reflection on British documents that described village communities and states of 19th century Indian society. To this information was added readings of travelers' accounts to the Middle East and Central Asia. A fact strikes Marx and Engels: the absence of private land ownership. In the manuscript Forman, Marx describes 7 different forms of land appropriation, that is to say, the dominant relation of production between men in pre-industrial societies. These forms follow one another up to the capitalist mode of production. This is what they're referencing here, and the footnote is about, in which the separation of the worker from the objective conditions of production is radical. Marx's text is therefore presented as a sketch of the evolution of landed property within human, and especially in Europe, and is a fragment detached from the analysis of the forms of primitive accumulation. This evolution seems to succeed. The primitive community, the Asiatic mode of production, ancient mode of production, slave mode of production, Germanic mode of production, feudal mode of production, capitalist mode of production. We will confine ourselves to a few words on the modes of production distinct from Asiatic, blah, 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 primitive, and then Godelier breaks all of them apart. And he goes into and reads, and where's the... I'm going to have to read. This is a lot. I probably should read it in the French. God damn it. Let's see. All right. Yeah. I'm going to have to read it. Keep an eye. I will come back to this because, one, I've been falling in love with Godelier lately. So, big time. Big time. So, yeah. That'll be fun. All right, we'll continue then. Let's continue with this section, see if we can, we're going to be finishing it. It's got, 3 paragraphs left. Any questions at this point before we move forward in this? Worth asking and confirming before we move forward. Just want to ask. All right. In a certain sense, it is necessary to say as much in regard to what comes after the primal state, in regard to what is resected by the state. It supersects what comes before, but resects the formations that follow. There, too, it is like an abstraction that belongs to another dimension, always at a remove and struck by latency, but that springs back and returns stronger than before in the later forms that lend it a concrete existence. A protean state, yet there has never been but one state. Whence the variations, all the variants of the new alliance, falling nevertheless under the same category. For example, feudalism not only presupposes an abstract despotic state that it divides into segments according to the regime of its private property and the rise of commodity production, but the latter induce in return the concrete existence of a feudal state in the proper sense of the term, where the despot returns as the absolute monarch. For it is a double error to think that the development of commodity production is enough to bring about feudalism's collapse. On the contrary, this development reinforces feudalism in many respects, offering the latter new conditions of existence and survival, and that feudalism of itself is in opposition to the state, which, on the contrary, as a feudal state, is capable of preventing commodities from introducing the decoding of flows that alone would be ruinous to the system under consideration. Read the footnote as we go. Maurice Dobb has shown how the development of commerce, of the market, and of money has very diverse effects on feudalism, all at times reinforcing serfdom and the whole array of feudal structures. Studies in the development of capitalism, reference note 70, Francis Hinker has elaborated the concept of state feudalism to show how the French absolute monarchy, in particular, maintained the productive forces and commodity production in the framework of feudalism that did not end until the 18th century. An important thing to add in the middle there. Because again, we're talking about feudalism. Is it incompatible with these things? Absolutely not, as they say. To continue. In more recent examples, we have to go along with Wittfogel when he shows the degree to which modern capitalist and socialist states take on the characteristic features of the primordial despotic state. As for democracies, how could one fail to recognize in them the despot who has become colder and more hypocritical, more calculating, since he must himself count and code instead of overcoding the accounts? It is useless to compose the list of differences after the manner of conscientious historians. Village communes here, industrial societies there, and so on. The differences could be determining only if the despotic state were one concrete formation amongst others to be treated comparatively. But the despotic state is the abstraction that is realized in imperial formations, to be sure, only as an abstraction, the overcoding immanent unity. It assumes its immanent concrete existence only in the subsequent forms that cause it to return under other guises and conditions. Being the common horizon for what comes before and what comes after, it conditions universal history only provided it is not on the outside, but always off to the side, the cold monster that represents the way in which history is the head in the brain, the UrStaat. I actually think this is a very well-written paragraph that is fairly crisp in and of itself. And so it's tough for me to say exactly how to make this shorter or simpler, because it is fairly crisp. So we will just reread it, I think, is the only way to really do it. Reread and break down. And as I go, feel free to put a big question mark or a what the fuck, and we'll spend a little bit extra time as we go sentence by sentence. I usually don't do this, but this one is important. The previous paragraph, just to sort of end it, ends with, in the end, one no longer really knows what comes first, whether the territorial machine does not in fact presuppose a despotic machine from which it extracts the bricks that it segments in its turn. In a certain sense, it is necessary to say as much in regard to what comes after the primal state, in regard to what is resected by the state. The creation of the state, immediately, it intersects, bisects, and resects all these different sort of aspects of the way the despot forms, of the way people form, of the way the society works. The state pierces, comes through all those. It supersects what comes before even the territorial machine. It supersects this, but resects the formations that follow. There too, it is an abstraction belonging to another dimension, always at a remove and struck by latency, but springing back, returning stronger than before in the later forms that lend it a concrete existence. The state always has this abstractive reality to it. It's always doing this. It's playing this. It is like an abstraction in another dimension, this cerebral thing that they've been talking about. Always at a remove, always struck by latency, but somehow stronger than before in the later forms that lend it a concrete existence, continually hardening what the state is, how the state operates. Every move that is made, the state essentially becomes more concretized. It becomes more exacting. Please jump in.
Yeah, when you use the word superstate, superset, can you define that in in terms of in contrast to reset, or Yeah. Instead of reset, it's superset. What does superset mean?
All right.
It means expand or
I think to do this right, I'm going to actually just jump to the French, and I'm going to try to find it there, because I think that's going to be the best bet to actually helping that. Let me see what the original French said. Give me a second. If someone else wants to answer, by the way, you're free to. Okay. Circuit. It overcuts. When we say sect, we mean slicing, piercing off, making parts. This is the segmentizing of bricks, right? This is the phrasing they're using. It's why they're using the spatial phrasing. So when we say, there too it is an abstraction, belongs to another dimension, always at a remove and struck by latency, springs back, returns later. A protein state, blah, blah, blah. The right before that, sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. In a certain sense, it is necessary to say as much in regard to what comes after the primal state, in regard to what is resected by this state. The primal state, the Abraham, the starting place, the uniting of the tribes, the creation of this resects everything. It slices apart and it partitions everything out. It supersects. Supersects is a weird word. But also supercuts is also that super partitions. It creates sort of a retroactive partitioning that supersedes the elements that comes before. So when we talk about Abraham uniting the tribes didn't just get to live their own fun little existence. Now, necessarily, everything they did has been supersected and claimed for use in different ways by the despot, by the state. The state is the bureaucratic apparatus that slices off pottery, that slices off hunting, cooking, food, wig making, whatever the fuck, name a thing. And this is the thing it does. It supersects. It cuts above. It cuts from above those things.
Can I say one thing?
Please, please.
Because in French, it was be recouper and surcouper.
Yes.
So it's the same. I don't know how to say this in English, but the beginning of the words is the same as recoding and overcoding. You need to understand it the same way. It's recutting and overcutting.
It operates. It does operate. It's almost the same thing. The challenge is that they are using particular words because they are talking about the slicing off of. I mean, and Roger, I'm more talking to you and trying to understand this really, because it's an interesting question. The state, when we use the term, and they use the term intersect a lot, but in the original, it's the recouper, the resecting, the recutting, the recoding, I have. I'm gonna sound like a stupid person just for a second, so just allow me this and just tell me if I'm kind of in the right direction. Hi, I'm Steve in a village, and I'm in pre-communist whatever. I'm in my Earth Socius, and we've got stuff. I'm seeing gourds, and I'm seeing fucking dude get skin cut. All this stuff. This is desire, immediately being enacted and co-opted and consumed. This is my existence. Is this the way that gourd is the gourd tattoo is coded? The way codes move in this space is desire being immediately consumed. The state uniting all of this necessarily needs to create and slice. This is why they use, I think, the word because they use this throughout the cut of they're cutting desire, but they're cutting it into bricks that are code. And so what they're doing is they are recoding the codes we've made. They're recutting it and then overcutting it, overcoding it, turning it into new codes that subsume or take over this thing. That it overcuts, supercuts. It overcodes what came before, but it recuts what comes later. Actually, that is what literally it says. That's actually different than this text.
Yeah, and what comes later recuts what was there prior. So it's a double direction in
Is it that it
temporality.
recuts what was there prior, or it overcut? So this is
So it's recoupe, recut, and
recuts what
surcoupe.
follows, overcuts what came before.
No. The state will recut what has come prior to itself.
No, opposite.
No, that's it. Okay. So, et d'une certaine manière, il faut en dire autant de ce qui vient après l'état original, de ce que cet état recoupe. So the originary state is recutting, and then it is overcutting, which comes before.
Yeah, and
And
so it's
recut
to say here, because they use the
information that
term
is after.
they use the term, just I want to start right there because that's actually going to be really important, I think, to understanding this. They've discussed earlier the Mycenaean manuscript, the palimpsest, the way that it is overwritten. A palimpsest is a manuscript that you sort of write over because paper was really, really, really fucking expensive. So you would do it again, just like with a VHS tape or with a cassette tape. Kids don't do this, or with hard drives. Hard drives get overcoded all the fucking time. If we're talking, are we talking here about that same thing, that we're talking about the palimpsest, where what came before the state just simply overwrites, it overcodes, because it is literally meant to sort of like literally over being the thing. It means doing again and again and again, and it will constantly do so. Whereas recut means to do again. Over means it will be again and again and again. It's like how to say, let's say there's a conveyor belt temporality of time where the state's sitting here and there are the codes in front of me, and codes in front of me, I recode and I kind of shit them out, and I've got my shitting out behind me. But lo and behold, hey, look, things are changing. Okay, cool. I just retroactively rewrite over all of those things, but I do it all the time. So I'm
So-
overcutting and overcoding the shit that came before, recutting the stuff that has already been cut once because it needed to be coded once. That's sort of the nature of the beast as things move.
Mhm.
Is that, yeah?
Yeah. So there was like cuts before into the previous arrangement, and the state will recut those and will overcut those and recut what will come after.
Yeah.
I'm just re-saying the sentence that is there. I'm not inventing anything. It's just to see the process of how those two temporalities are working at once. You can go forward in time, but you also go, over what has been done already, and you recompose what is already there.
Okay, so I'm going to say something that sounds very confused in my brain, but it's actually, I think I'm starting to really, because this fits with State and Politics, that book, and it's a thing I've been struggling with. So I think because there's this weird thing that's happening, because we're talking about kind of a lot of positions that are talking about this. But if we talk about the state formation of blank, the state formation that I'm naming, pick fucking China, pick goddamn Rome or Greece, the state formation, if we're analyzing the state, it necessarily will overcode the things that came before it from my position of looking back at it, and it will also resect the things in front of it. I'm literally building the temporality of that state and its abstraction from my position.
Mm-hmm.
And so this really fucked up thing happens because we're talking about my position. This makes more sense because this is the issue with having the list of fucking, I guess, 7 things to Grial, but Marx is like 4 or 5 things or 6 things, depending if you want to ask, like, what are the 5 states or types of states? And it's like, no, the way that it works is that you have all of these, but only because you've created these delineations, specifically delineations that supersect that which came before, resect formations that follow, and you're able to do that in each of these steps. But it's still just the fucking state, because what the state does is that thing. It does that thing. That's how it works. Oh, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. And see, sometimes we glance over those, we're trying to understand things, and those little sentences sometimes that seems to be really blurry and really confusing. Sometimes they're the key of understanding how, for this specific instant of the UrStaat, it's in the form of diagrammatic machine, and how it functions, and how it's always there. It preordinates everything that comes after it, but it's still there into every of the formation. So,
Well, and
and
because it's overcoding and oversecting, I think I'm going to start using the word oversecting because I think it's interesting. But when I talk today, and I'm like, we go back and we talk about, I don't know, tax collectors in medieval times underneath a king. It it is overwritten by the idea of the tax collector. They aren't even the same fucking thing. They didn't work the same. They don't operate the same. They aren't even really the same type of person. An IRS agent is not like how a tax collector worked in like 1100 in London, right?
yeah,
So
but they're both named John, so it's
yeah, but
fine.
they're both named John, so we just consider them the same fucking thing. But like this is that act of overcoding, because then we're able to fool ourselves into thinking, well, look, these pieces have always existed. There's always been someone collecting tax. There's always been a military. There's always been generals, because it's necessarily overriding, overcoding that thing that came before, and it's resecting the elements that come after based on the temporality of when it's really crazy. Because that's the next line they have is, there too, it is an abstraction that belongs to another dimension, always at a remove and struck by latency, but that springs back and returns stronger than before in the later forms that lend it a concrete existence. There was no like a tax collector that existed in the medieval times. There wasn't a bureaucratic apparatus around the tax collector. It's not how it worked. Over time, as those positions have resected the future, but also, sort of layered in and created power in the various bureaucratic means that the state has, those gain a concrete existence. The IRS and how it operates in the US, or how tax collection operates in any liberal democracy globally. I mean, even in China is effectively the same core system. And it's deeply concrete in its existence. Well, that's actually really fucking cool.
And just see the example. Just reread the example that they give after for feudalism, and you'll understand. Like, it's when they give an example, they're pretty clear on the movement of things.
Yeah,
Just read it out loud.
Otter Waffle nails it. It's coupe. There's a lot of ways to translate. This is why translation is interesting and the use of these words. And Roger, since you're speaking, I'm going to say a thing. Otter Waffle says we got to consider the meaning of coupe and recoupe and sous-coupe as in a figurative way, which is shuffling, reshuffling, or shuffling to get a better hand as well. Which we would also use cutting, because we use cutting cards and instead of shuffling as well. So it's the way that things are ordered, the reordering of things, the separating of things, the cutting of the deck in order to get, to reshuffle it back in, recutting the deck and placing things. It is the same deck of cards, but we've recut it, we've replaced it, we've moved things around, and over time, yeah. So this is really, there's a temporality to this that's really interesting. Sous-coupe is very much used like this. Over shuffling. That's fascinating. That's not over shuffle. I'm anglicizing it to try to like play with it, but it's very fascinating to see that use. To overcut.
See, just give me one sec. In playing cards, and that's what the other waffle posted that from the University of Sherbrooke. It says, aux cartes, couper avec un atout supérieur à celui qui vient d'être joué. I'm just doing a shitty Google translation, but like in card playing, is to cut with a trump higher than the one just played. So there's a bonus. So there's like an higher order when you overcut. And I think
that 1 sec, that sentence makes no sense. I don't understand what that means. In cards, cut with the trump card higher than the one just played.
in playing cards in a card game.
Yeah, I
When
know
you
of
when
them.
you yeah, okay, that's good. So so a natu, I don't know what does a natu would be. It's probably a trump. I don't know the
No, trump card for sure. That one I kind of know.
So surcoupé would
It's
give you an
a
advantage.
higher
into
card,
the recutting.
advantage card, like the
So overcutting would give you would be different from recutting, as it gives you an advantage.
how
Or
how
because you can recut, and then it just like shuffles card again, but it's the act of reshuffling that would give you a better end of cards.
I have a big problem because I play a fuck ton of cards and I don't.
But that's the example that they give.
I know it's just a terrible fucking example because it's just confusing as shit. Fucking academics, man. Like, go fucking learn to play cards before using it as a goddamn example. How do you shuffle to get a better card?
So
what does that mean?
So okay, so I think it's Jack. I have no idea because he changes his name all the time. Ignis Fatis.
Yeah, it's Jack.
Okay, gave the example of Nietzsche with the Übermensch, and this it would be the Surman or the Overman, or because it's not just like rehashing men, it's men plus, it's men going somewhere else. Le cercle rouge, okay, but to recut would be a reman, just a reman man. But no, you don't want to do this. You want to overman. You want to go over by reshuffling the composition of man. It leads you to something else, a new form. But that's what the difference between re and over is.
I get it in everything else, and now I'm completely fucked because of this completely shitty explanation of trump cards. It's a terrible fucking.
Let it go.
I don't know. I've got whatever. Not gonna care right now. That like literally is a rabbit hole for later. Let's keep walking our way through this though. Whatever it may be, we're just gonna go back to the original thing. And before I got confused, god damn it, you French people. There too, it is like an abstraction belonging to another, always at a remove and struck by latency, but that springs back and returns stronger than before in the later forms that lend it this concrete existence. As we said, it's over time, these things that presuppose their own retroactive existence because they are overcoding, recut things in the future in order to sort of splice them up and sort of prepare them for that process. It's fascinating. A protean state. It's bridge. Thank you. It's bridge. Thank you very much, Otter Waffle. Okay, I get it now. Okay, it's bridge. That makes more sense. I was thinking other things. A protean state, yet there has never been but one state. They're again taking issue with the idea that there's like a primitive state, and then we moved into these other forms, and Marx's idea of these 7 versions that Grial went over. Whence the variations, all the variants of the new alliance, falling nevertheless under the same category. All of these are ultimately the state. For example, feudalism not only presupposes an abstract despotic state that it divides into segments according to the regime of its private property, the rise of commodity production. That's them describing how a feudalistic state handles private property. But the latter, the rise of its command, the latter induce in return the concrete existence of a feudal state in the proper sense of the term, where the despot returns as the absolute monarch. This is the nature of the feudalistic state, as they're talking about it. This abstract despotic state divides feudalism into segments according to the regime of private property, the rise of commodity production, but ultimately it does, in return, this concrete existence, return the feudal state properly, where the despot returns as king, the king of this. It's a double error to think that the development of commodity production is enough to bring about feudalism's collapse, which is, I mean, that's what a lot of people are taught these days. And I think a lot of Marxists even think this, that, oh, we have commodities and that's what did it. It's like, no, the development actually reinforces feudalism. And it does. And you can see actually in a lot of countries in the last 100 years, as they made their move into more of what you might call democratic liberal state or a more despotic style state, that the feudal sort of elements of things and the divisions, the partitioning off of things, actually reinforces feudalism in that setup, offering the latter, the feudalism, new conditions of existence and survival. And ultimately, feudalism, and that feudalism of itself is in opposition to the state, which it's not. In the contrary, as a feudal state, it is capable of preventing commodities from introducing a decoding of flux that alone would be ruinous to the system under consideration. This is, again, Marx outright said this, and that's why I like to talk about Deleuze as being like super Marxy. The state exists to maintain the power structure and the superstructure of production that's dominant. And the example that he gives here is this feudal state that prevents commodities being produced, that are actively being produced, but that aren't being abstracted or turned into the space capitalism would allow, that would ultimately be ruinous to the feudal state. That's what the state does. The state regulates production to that point. They have examples what Fogel talks about when he shows the degree to which modern capitalist and socialist states take on characteristic features of the primordial despotic state. He was talking about USSR and Russia and China and all of that. As for democracies, how could one fail to recognize in them the despot who has become colder and more hypocritical, calculating, since he must himself count and code instead of overcoding the accounts? He's talking about France, but also I think America and most modern democracies of the time. I don't think it's hard for anyone here to understand the shift there that they're talking about, where the state is sort of more baked in, the bureaucratic apparatus more baked in, the despot seen within it, who is colder and more hypocritical and calculating, because they then count and code instead of overcoding all of the accounts. They have to count and code. What's a good example? U.S. Congress is a fucking good example of this. Well, a bunch of psychotics. The way that it's very easy for people to talk about the Child Protection Act that was in existence during just following COVID for like 2 months, where people got free childcare or they got a stipend for it, and it literally brought children out of poverty. Like, I think just an extraordinary number of children out of poverty. But it wasn't really enough, and just very coldly getting rid of it because we just can't have such a thing. We need to get back to having labor. Like, literally, this is how they talked about it. You go watch the debates. Repealing it because labor was beginning to get crunched because people didn't want to work as hard because they didn't have to, because, mostly people work for survival these days. So it's a really good example of that, actually. This is the despot, colder and more hypocritical and calculating. It's useless to compose the list of differences after the manner of conscientious historians. This is historians looking out over things and going, oh, look, there's village communes here and industrial societies there. And this is calling it that from our position. But The despotic state is the abstraction that is realized, and imperial formations, to be sure, only as an abstraction. In these imperial formations, it's only this sort of abstractive element. It hasn't become as concretized as it has over time, where it is for sure now, dear God. The overcoding immanent unity of things, the Abraham uniting the tribes, there was a state there, more abstract, certainly, but only as abstraction, because as these things began to exist, and it did, immediately all of these things existed, as time passed, the state adjusted itself, concretized some things, rewrote the past, overwrote the past, rewrote the things that came along, and moved. It assumes an imminent concrete existence only in subsequent forms that cause it to return under other guises and conditions. We may have had the first UrStaat, more abstract, but becoming more concrete every time it has to change and adjust and fix how it operates. It is the common horizon for what comes before and what comes after. It conditions universal history, only provided it is not on the outside, but always just off to the side. This cold monster that represents the way in which history is in the head and in the brain, the UrStaat. That last bit I really like. All right. Next paragraph. Next paragraph. Good Marx stuff. Marx recognized there was indeed a way in which history proceeded from the abstract to the concrete. Quote, the simple categories are the expression of relations within which the less developed concrete may have already realized itself before having posited the more many-sided connection or relation which is mentally expressed in the more concrete category, while the more developed concrete preserves the same category as a subordinate relation. That's good, Marx. The state was first this abstract unity that integrated sub-aggregates functioning separately. It is now subordinated to a field of forces whose flux it coordinates and whose autonomous relations of domination. And you're not muted as you're yelling, just letting you know.
Yes.
Roger. Damn it. You're muted. The state was first this abstract unity that integrated sub-aggregates functioning separately. It is now subordinated to a field of forces whose flux it coordinates and whose autonomous relations of domination and subordination it expresses. It is no longer content to overcode maintained and imbricated territorialities. It must constitute, invent codes for the decoded flux of money, commodities, and private property. It no longer of itself forms a ruling class or classes. It is itself formed by these classes, which have become independent and delegate it to serve their power and their contradictions, their struggles and their compromises with the dominated classes. It is no longer the transcendent law that governs fragments. It must fashion, as best it can, a whole to which it will render its law immanent. It is no longer the pure signifier that regulates its signifieds. It now appears behind them, depending on the things it signifies. It no longer produces an overcoding unity. It is itself produced inside the field of decoded flux. As a machine, it no longer determines a social system. It is itself determined by the social system into which it is incorporated in the exercise of its functions. In brief, it does not cease being artificial, but it becomes concrete. It tends to concretization, while subordinating itself to dominant forces. The existence of an analogous evolution has been demonstrated for the technical machine when it ceases to be an abstract unity or intellectual system reigning over separate subaggregates to become a relation that is subordinated to a field of forces operating as a concrete physical system. This is like a crazy dense paragraph. If you don't have a lot of background, I'm unmuting you, by the way, Roger. But if you don't have a decent background in Marx, I think a few others actually too, it's gonna be a little tougher. But the big deal here, they kind of state, I think, cleanly at the end that, well, it started as this abstract thing that Abraham unites the tribes. He didn't go, also, here is a state and here's my bureaucracy and setup. It's much more along the lines of what you find emergently sort of growing, because we need to take care of all of these disparate tribes. All these tribes have different specialties. All of these tribes, we need to figure out how to unite them and bring them together. How do we do such a thing? Well, hey, Steve, why don't you go tell them, go figure out who writes the best. Go figure out who cooks the best food. Go figure out who mines the best. Go figure out who builds the best furniture, all that shit. And then we'll start telling them, you guys do this, and we'll have them trade back and forth, and we'll kind of manage that, and we'll take a cut for ourselves. This setup it's an abstraction of a state because they haven't.
Not a good decision to go there.
Okay, that's Roger is unaware that he's on. But it's this play that's happening here is the move of the abstract, that as these things that were effectively emergent when they first started socially, over time, as the state goes, it is overcoding the things that came before and recoding the things that it's passing into. And it continues to do so. And it does so, as it does this, it moves from being the thing that is the state oppressing people and controlling people, or in determining people, but instead people now determine it. The transition that is fascinating, and it's why they want to talk about a single state and how the state operates, is this. It's the way that class changes. They don't want us to think of, oh, well, the state now is in better service of people. It's a different state. It's like, no. What it's doing and how it's working, it's the same state, and it's doing the same shit, but it's doing it in an almost subterranean way, where it used to be that the literal priests and the high council and the people in charge were part of the state, explicitly an aristocracy or a plutocracy, or whatever you want to call it. The philosopher kings could be in control. That setup, they'd be determining the state and everyone else. The state would be determining who they are, how they set up. It's not the case. Now, the bourgeois are actually determining the state. The elite are determining the state as they're aware of, to basically keep those that are in control in control. The dominant forces are now in power, instead of the state crafting forces and being the dominant power itself. It may be a switch, but this shift changes. Use the example of the technical machine, which is Marx spent a huge amount of time on, because it's an analogous evolution. It's these pieces come about. Oh, look, we build this thing. This technical machine exists. It's an abstract unity. Hey, look, I built this really interesting contraption. It does a thing. Well, now we call it, okay, well, now it's this thing. And over time, that intellectual system that begins to sort of reign over the subaggregates, it becomes concretized, that thing that once was this emergent element, the way technical machines ultimately come to control, but be controlled also in turn. It's fascinating. Hope that makes any sense at all. It's a complex thing from Marx, to say the least. But it's good stuff. Good stuff, I promise. It is not literally the bourgeoisie, it's the elite. Thank you, Jack, correcting me specifically. They want us to not be thinking about class in that way. Yes, correct. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, he uses the term feud of forces and, dominant forces and so forth. And so that implies that there is a despotic a signifier, right, behind these various classes and appearances of free, behind money and so forth. And but what they're saying is that there is behind these this facade of social relations, there is a dominant despotic signifier. Is that
the despot sticking around? Yeah, the despot sticks around in this, but not in the same form or same way. But yeah, there is still some other thing that's happening. That the the despotic overcoding and how it operates is within the state, part and parcel. That's how I read it.
So it would be like a United Kingdom and Canada. Would they are they more honest about the despotic signifier then by having maintaining the kind of at least the symbol of a monarchy, right?
Um, hmm. Hmm. Wish Roger was listening. I would, my first reaction, let me just go with that then. My first reaction is to go not quite in the sense of the king or the queen, the despot that exists in the UK or the US in our presidential dynasties, which we literally fucking have now. The setup that is sort of being played at here is that the positions or placements within the state and the monarchy would be one. The king would become this, even though the despotic signification, the way that signification operates now plays within the state and sort of continues on through state apparatus of capture. The setup that is being played here is a little bit different than saying, oh, they still have a despot. Not so much that, it's that the despotic signification and the capture of the apparatus of capture that is the state begins to capture social forms and social structures and concretizes very particular power structures over time. So the king and actually the king would be an interesting one. The king is the guy in charge. He's a despotic signifier. But again, remember, the despot is a full body. The human who's in his place, the king or whatever, is just a person in that position. Now that the UK exists, they still have a king. Technically, Canada still has a fucking king, King Charles of Canada or whatever. Like these really weird sort of realities that position is more concretized, less abstract, and more specified in exactly what it is. And it's very much figureheady and particularized that way. But their position is concretized and sort of overwritten through time, again, in very much the same way. All right, Jack, let's talk about classes. We're getting through this. I'm going to read the next paragraph in a few, and we're getting through this, and we're not ending it at the hour. So I want to, come on, Jack, get going. We're talking about classes. Let's go. Come on. All right. I would argue they are saying particularly here that it's specifically the controlling class, ruling class that are now independent of the state, but effectively playing the function, but now control it and use it in their struggles with the dominated class or classes. That there is a system of maybe multiple classes. It doesn't have to be just bourgeois and proletariat, but that there is a class in control that they're talking about here, I think, pretty cleanly.
And I guess I'm saying I don't think it's a question of the subordination of the proletariat or like a proletarian in a sense. The bourgeois has many uses, yes. So too does the proletariat. So it's classes as opposed to like a class, I think.
There's a
But I think
dominant
later
class
on
and a
they're gonna, like,
subordinate
merge into
class.
one.
It's a dominant and subordinate class.
Perhaps.
I mean, that's the wording they're using. So is it
So
less? Because we like to think of sorry,
the
go ahead. Sorry.
the three parts of the state, right? The state is mutually constitutive of all three, right? What I'm getting at is that class is mutually constitutive of the classes, right? So the thing I'm trying to avoid is that the focus, much like looking for an emperor becomes looking for the bourgeois alone, right? If there is bourgeois proletariat, it's mutually constitutive.
I agree with that. And I think if I'm saying something that is opposing that, I would probably apologize. Probably more flippant uses of bourgeois or anything like that sort of does presuppose the idea of a class that is outside of it. To me, that they come ultimately the state and how it enacts, and again, because people are historically determined as much as anything else, and the state is deeply dominating historically and determining socially, the classes that would come of it would be and I do think they are talking about classes or a caste system of sorts that is coming out of the state, where there are people who are more in control than the subjugated groups that they're going to come to talk about. There are people who are the dominant classes, which we clearly have in the U.S., for example, or France clearly has. We have dynasties of presidents and congressmen, for fuck's sake. Like, we have a dominant class that controls and determines the state far more than any of us who are probably on the server. And that seems to me what they're talking about here. So it's tough. They are using class distinctions though. And so I'm not disagreeing with you, but it is
Yeah. At the same time, so the state was first this abstract unity that integrated sub-aggregates functioning separately, which we covered in terms of like, it's kind of like the municipal problem for the empire, so to speak.
Mhm.
It is now subordinated. So the state is now subordinated to a field of forces whose flows it coordinates. So in its subordination, the state also coordinates, and whose autonomous relations of domination and subordination it expresses. So the state also expresses the autonomous relations of domination and subordination, right? So like
right.
the what's hitting there, at least for me, is that like there's something about class which is expressed through the state, and yet at the same time, I think, at least for me, class. On one hand, they're going to talk about two classes, right? On the other hand, I think they're just going to say there's only one class in effect. And that's where you have to be kind of witty about it.
Well, then I would ask, because one of the things that they're talking about is this a genealogy of sorts, where we really do have only one state, and it takes multiple forms inside of various hypocritical, lying, bullshit, obfuscating states, the positions that it's in. Classes feels like it would be one of those things that the state, because I would argue very clearly that during despotic or even over time, I could point to very clean expressions of class or caste in various societies that, I mean, it'd be silly not to talk about those as meaningful within the state apparatus or within their setup. But it may be that, just to finish that thought though, it's not so much that the classes are, the class or class struggle is actually the sort of base value, or the, like Marx would say, the thing that is causing all of history to continue to move forward, but instead that class is a determination of the state, and that the formation of the concretization of these classes over time is a function of the state, not necessarily socially determined or a priori reality of humanity.
Yeah, I mean, class struggle is definitely worth questioning here, because how does class, if you go into class struggle, you can miss some of the things they're getting at, to your point, right? So like, the problem they're dealing with here is like, so this section is kind of getting at like how you move from the despotic to capital, right? How the UrStaat kind of differs between the two, even though they haven't introduced capital yet. So like, where this is hitting is this point about so one of the things that transcendent uses do, right, is they're kind of creating ideas and they're working with the abstract. Once we start moving to capital, right, we get into this problem of the abstract becoming concrete. And that's where this stuff is changing, because before the state includes the caste, right? Um, and is so defined, right? Now we're getting into a place where the castes have been negated, so to speak, are outside of the state, and the positions have kind of shifted, right? Now the state is doing coding
But
and overcoding.
but again, we have to think about it in terms of the because again, these things, the state came all at once, but over time, as these things changed, there isn't just suddenly a oh look, we're here kind of thing, and then the next group of people doesn't have a historical determination. The way that this superstructure operates, the people that it was under a despotic rule, the people that were given land, the landed gentry, and the people around that, this very much are the people who are still in power today. Like they still have land, they still have a lot of control. That it's an insane sort of thing. There's a reason we have princes and kings of many countries running some of the largest investment funds that there are. The way that this works now, though, is before the state and the despot and that form of production determined the classes and determined that position. Now, because over time those positions have concretized, because it again it overcodes the past, recodes the future as it makes its way through, and it's sort of chomping and constantly moving. This setup then puts people in those positions, and those people now are the ones who they are historically and socially determined, but not necessarily by the state. It's more in conjunction with the state, and then they then have the power within the state or over the state or elements of the state in order to maintain and build a relationship and deal with the issues that it may have with struggles and compromises with the dominated classes. And that's again more as time has gone on, these are the dominated classes. It's not that the state determines who's a bourgeois, it's that those people sort of are determined historically, and now that they're empowered, they do control those sort of parts of the state.
I mean, it's always a question of how change functions, right? So, I mean, in some of this, like, I have to use 3.9 to kind of explain, so I don't want to go at it too hard, but like the flows themselves are going to become labor and capital, right? And
Yes.
that's kind of the transition.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, like, with this discussion about the state and this point about like sub-aggregates and zones and aggregates as a question of groups, right? And the connective synthesis, right? In this way, like, we're dealing with class and caste um, in terms of aggregations, right? In terms of groups. So in this sense, like the dominated and the subordinated, right? This expression of domination and subordination is happening through the state because the state is taking on this role of doing coding here, right? So you have it's like Marx's congealment, right? Price has to be stuck to a commodity, right? Otherwise, it just stays abstract in your head. Um, or more poignantly, it stays abstract to the economic market. It's a similar point with class, right? Class has becoming concrete through the state that expresses subordination and domination is what I'm getting out of this. So, class is kind of it's kind of floating, and that's kind of the interesting thing about it, right?
Yeah, it's exactly the interesting thing. And we'll be making our way
It's
in.
not something inside of people.
Well, no, well, exactly. I think that's ultimately the point, is that there isn't. Marx has this conception. I think a lot of people who sort of are on the sort of whatever intellectualized Marxist sort of train, the idea that the proletariat is the proletariat, and that they just have to wake up. They should know and that they're part of this class. That's who you are. That's the bourgeois. Here are the people who are the bourgeois, and that it's not the case, that there's a historical determined reality to this, the state as part of that, and the state interacting with that.
It gets tricky. I'll be real quick and I'll give it to you, JK. I want to make this point here real quick. And then part of this gets tricky because, like, consider the Russian Revolution, just generally speaking, right? Insofar as we could think of the Bolsheviks as proletariat, given the way they dressed and everything, right? It becomes a new bourgeois too, right? And this is that kind of two states kind of being one state point they'll get at later. I'm sorry, two classes kind of being one class point. But
Yeah,
as promised, all yours, JK.
go for it, JK, and then we'll do the last paragraph and we'll do a roundup and be done.
Yeah, so even in a democratic society, as long as it's also in an oligarchy, you would still have these, this kind of dominant forces operating, right, throughout the society, right, in terms of class structure and so forth. And the most dominating, class would be the oligarchy, right, who perhaps they're probably controlling the levers of the state, the government, the state, by way of the government, whose pockets they line.
Well, see, and that's kind of what I'm raising the question, right? Because you got to remember the state is an apparatus that the Socius uses. So, like, at least as I read it, right, it's not people behind the state, it's the Socius using the state, and the conditions of that vary by Socius. The despotic Socius will use the state to overcode. Capitalist Socius will do, well, this is kind of what we're getting here with the becoming concrete. It becomes more involved, shall we say, with capital, because it can also decode. So the question of democracy depends on the Socius, in which case you can have a despotic use of democracy, right, as a state through the UrStaat, and you can have capital using democracy as capital using the, say, the UrStaat here.
So the footnote on this one, 64, which is that last little bit, is not Marx. I thought I recognized it, and I'm just dumb. It is our friend Simondon. We have lovely reading here every week. It's on our YouTube channel. Catch up. I believe they've done all of modes of existence of technical production. But this is the nature of the technical evolution, specifically the genesis of a technical object and the process of concretization. Deeply important to this. And I'm going to probably want to do a mini reading with I'm going to grab the guys who do this because they're going to be able to explain it far better than I think I can. But this would be literally, it's chapter 1 of On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects. Talks through specifically the shift of how a technical machine works, which I think is deeply important to all of this, because they're saying it's analogous. The machine ceases to be an abstract unity or an intellectual system reigning over separate subaggregates to become a relation subordinated to a field of forces operating as a concrete physical system. This is the forward movement of how really disparate things become abstracted, then made concrete, which makes them subordinate to other abstractions. And it kind of is this system moving, constantly moving things to this position of concretization, to actualization. I'm going to read the next paragraph because it continues that thought. Simondon, read Simondon. He's great. But isn't this tendency to concretization in the social or technical machine precisely the movement of desire? Again and again, we come upon the monstrous paradox. The state is desire that passes from the head of the despot to the hearts of his subjects, as from the intellectual law to the entire physical system that disengages or liberates itself from the law. A state desire, the most fantastic machine for repression, is still desire. The subject that desires and the object of desire. Desire, such is the operation that consists in always stamping the mark of the primordial UrStaat on the new state of things, rendering it immanent to the new system insofar as possible, making it interior to this system. As for the rest, it will be a question of starting again from zero, the founding of a spiritual empire there, where forms exist under which the state can no longer function as such in the physical system. When the Christians took possession of the empire, this complementary duality reappeared between those who wanted to do everything possible to reconstruct the UrStaat from the elements they found in the immanence of the objective Roman world, and the purists who wanted a fresh start in the wilderness, a new beginning for a new alliance, a rediscovery of the Egyptian and Syriac inspiration that would provide the impotence for a transcendent UrStaat. What strange machines those were that cropped up in columns and in tree trunks. In this sense, Christianity was able to develop a whole set of paranoiac and celibate machines, a whole string of paranoiacs and perverts, who also form part of our history's horizon and people our calendar. These are two aspects of a becoming of the state, its internalization in a field of increasingly decoded social forces, forming a physical system, its spiritualization in a supra-terrestrial field that increasingly overcodes, forming a metaphysical system. The infinite debt must become internalized at the same time it becomes spiritualized. The hour of bad conscience draws nigh. It will also be the hour of the greatest cynicism, quote, that repressed cruelty of the animal man made inward and scared back into himself, creature imprisoned in the state so as to be tamed. To read the footnote, which is a worthwhile, the history's horizon of people who people are calendars. In this regard, Jacques Lacharet has called attention to the figures and the moments of Christian asceticism, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, starting with the 3rd century. First come gentle paranoiacs who install themselves close to a village, then withdraw into the desert, where they invent astonishing ascetic machines expressing their struggle against the old alliance and filiations. This would be the St. Anthony stage. Next, communities of disciples are formed, monasteries, where one of the main activities is to write the life of the founding saint. Celibate machines with a military discipline, where the monk reconstructs around him in the form of ascetic and collective restraints the aggressive universe of the old persecutions, the St. Pachomus stage. And finally, the return of the city or the village, armed groups of perverts who assign themselves the task of struggling against the dying paganism. Dying paganism. This is the Schnudi stage. More generally, concerning the monastery's relation with the city, see Louis Mumford, who talks about an elaboration of a new form of urban structuralism through the monasteries. These steps, these breaks that still play with these things. It's really fantastic. And it is, yes, Ben, the White Goddess, once you read it, it really does come through all of this. And Graves didn't know what he was doing, but goddamn, it's great. Go read the White Goddess. It's very good. I think with that, I'm actually going to leave that one because there's so much here that is hinting at what we're making the next move towards, which is the civilized capitalist machine, which is the next Socius, which is the next chapter. And I think going through and discussing really is going to be a thing they're going to be coming to. They're throwing out a lot of elements that are literally about how we're making our movement of deterritorialization that shows up. The first sentence of the next paragraph of the next chapter. The first great movement of deterritorialization appears with the overcoding performed by the despotic state. This is the first movement, and they're going to be continuing through that and talking through all the things they just asked about. But it's the line that's worth just noting. Isn't this tendency to concretization in socially technical machines precisely that of desire? Beautiful sentence that the answer is yes. So it's worth considering. Really fantastic. Thank you all for joining us this week. That was solid. Burned my brain up. Next week, we'll be moving into 3.9. We'll be doing a recoup sometime this weekend. I'll do another one of those sort of streams. It'll be in the evening for our friends who can't join us at night, in the morning or afternoon or whatever the fuck it is for everyone. So it'll be like 8 hours from now, whatever. But we'll do a sort of recapitulation and talk. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you all.